I turned 70 on a quiet Saturday in May. The garden behind my house glowed with strings of yellow lights, and for the first time in years, every chair at the long wooden table was filled. My daughter Emily had baked a cake herself, imperfect but beautiful, just like the life I'd built. I raised my glass and said, "At 70, I don't need gifts, just your presence." They laughed and clapped. For a moment, I felt like the house was alive again. Mark, my oldest, stood up with his arm around his wife, Linda. "Dad, he said we actually got you something special this year, something to make things easier for you." Linda stepped forward, smiling, holding a red envelope tied with a golden ribbon. "This one's from both of us," she said softly. "Think of it as our way of saying thank you." I chuckled. "You didn't have to. You already do so much." I reached out and patted Mark's shoulder. "I'm proud of how you've taken care of this family." For a second, her eyes weren't smiling. I untied the ribbon and pulled out a folded piece of paper, thick, formal. Before I could read it, Linda slipped a pen into my hand. "Go ahead," she whispered. "You'll love what's inside." The candle beside me flickered once, then went out. The night went still. Emily leaned closer and whispered, "Dad, don't sign too fast." Mark and Linda exchanged a quick glance, too quick, too rehearsed. My hand trembled as the pen hovered over the paper. I thought it was a birthday card, but it was something that could erase everything I'd worked for. Would you still blow out the candles if you knew what was inside that envelope? After the toast, the night softened. The garden smelled of grilled meat and roses, and the string lights above hummed like tired stars. For a moment, it almost felt like the house had been reborn. Emily's cake sat near the edge of the table, lopsided but beautiful. She caught me staring and smiled. "You happy, Dad?" she asked. "Happier than I've been in years," I said. And for a second, it was true. Mark and Linda stood near the grill, whispering. Their faces were close, their smiles too polite, too practiced. My stomach tightened, but I brushed it off. Families always have secrets. The trick is knowing which ones to forgive. Mark has always been the dreamer. At 45, he still talks about the next big thing. He once told me, "Dad, money's like oxygen. You don't notice it until it's gone." I never forgot those words because they sounded less like wisdom and more like a warning. Linda, on the other hand, is sharp as glass. Everything about her feels calculated, her tone, her words, even her kindness. I don't dislike her, but she makes me nervous. Emily, she's the quiet one, the reason I still remember how to laugh. A week before the party, I told them, "Let's keep it simple, no big plans." Linda laughed. "Come on, Frank's 70's a milestone, you deserve something bigger." Emily shook her head. "Love doesn't need catering, Linda." Linda smirked. "And disappointment doesn't need planning, dear." I stepped in before it turned ugly. "It's just one night. Let's not turn it into a debate." They went quiet, but silence can be louder than words. When the party began, the backyard looked like a magazine spread, white tablecloths, champagne flutes, golden balloons. It wasn't my style, but I smiled anyway. Emily leaned toward me. "Over the top, huh?" "It's fine," I said. "At least everyone showed up." Then I heard Linda's voice as she walked by, low and quick, into her phone. "Yes, Mr. Lewis. We'll get the signature tonight. He trusts us." I froze. "Signature?" I told myself she meant the guest book, but Emily across the table looked up, her brow furrowed. "Dad, that didn't sound like catering. Why would they need your signature tonight?" I forced a laugh. "Probably just the guest list, honey. Don't overthink it." But she didn't laugh. She stared at Linda like she was memorizing every word. "If you heard your child plotting something behind your back, would you brush it off like I did, or would you confront them right there?" Later, Mark came to refill my glass. "You doing okay, Dad?" "I'm fine," I said. "Just trying to take it all in." He nodded. "Nice turnout. Linda did most of it. I can tell," I said. "She's good at organizing." He laughed too quickly. "Yeah, she's got a talent for making things official." "Official?" I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, just saying she likes things done right." His voice cracked. His hand shook slightly as he poured the wine. Emily joined us, wiping frosting from her fingers. "Mom would have loved this," she said softly. "Yeah," I whispered. She'd probably be complaining about the balloons. Emily laughed, and then fixed them herself. But when I looked around the table, I realized I was the only one really laughing. Everyone else was smiling, the kind of smile people wear when they're hiding something. Even the children were quieter than usual. Dinner ended and Linda raised her glass. To Dad, she said, her voice sweet but rehearsed, for building a family strong enough to survive anything, even us. The table laughed. I forced a smile. Even you, I said, trying not to flinch at the sting. Emily leaned in. That was weird, right? It's fine, honey. Let's not ruin the night. But deep down, I knew something already had. As guests began to leave, I lingered. Linda's heels clicked across the patio, her voice faint. Yes. Mr. Lewis, the paperwork's ready. Paperwork. My chest tightened. I turned my head, but she was already gone inside. Mark followed soon after. Emily came to sit beside me. You okay? I'm fine, I lied. Just thinking. About Mom, always. She smiled sadly. You still look for her in every quiet moment. I do, I admitted. But lately even the quiet feels crowded. Her frown deepened. What do you mean? Nothing. Forget it. The lights swayed in the breeze. The shadows stretched long across the lawn. I felt surrounded yet alone. From the porch, I saw Linda in the kitchen standing close to Mark. She was holding the same red folder I'd glimpsed earlier. Mark whispered something. I only caught the end. He'll sign tomorrow, if not tonight. Emily appeared at my side again. You hear that? She asked. I forced a calm voice. They're just tidying up. Her jaw tightened. No, Dad. They're planning something. Linda appeared in the doorway, her smile wide but her eyes cold. Everything all right out here? She asked. Emily's voice sharpened. Yeah, just making sure no one's signing anything they shouldn't. For a beat, no one moved. Then Linda laughed soft, brittle. Don't worry, sweetheart, she said. It's just family business. She turned back inside her heels, clicking like a clock counting down. And I sat there staring at the shadows swaying on the wall, realizing sometimes the warmest smiles hide the coldest motives. That night after the party, the house felt too quiet. The lights outside still glowed faintly, swinging in the breeze. I sat at the table, staring at the red envelope, small, neat, harmless. Beside it stood a photo of my wife, her smile dusted with flour. She'd been baking the day we got the keys. It's small, she'd said, laughing, but it echoes, and it still does. I remember the day we signed the deed. She pressed my hand when I hesitated. Frank, she said, you're building more than a house. You're building a promise, and I believed her. But promises are easy when you're young. It's the years that test them. Years later, Mark came to me with papers of his own. He had that same light in his eyes, the kind I once mistook for direction. Dad, he said, dropping a folder on the table. I just need your signature. It's safe, the bank just wants a name. My wife frowned. Frank, don't make him feel small, she said softly, then turned to Mark. But don't rush your father either. Mark smiled. It's just standard paperwork, nothing to worry about, I signed. And when his restaurant failed, I learned what signatures really cost. He came back weeks later, angry, his voice sharp. You never believed in me. I believed in you, son, I said quietly. Just not your shortcuts. He slammed the door, and that sound still echoes louder than laughter ever did. That night I found the contract tucked in my desk drawer. The ink had faded, but the line where I'd signed was still there like a scar. Since then I've kept every paper that asks for my name, but my pen stays capped. There's something cruel about regret. It doesn't yell, it whispers. And that whisper followed me for years until the house fell quiet again. When my wife got sick, I stopped fixing things. The fence leaned, the paint peeled, and for the first time I didn't care. Emily noticed. Dad, she said one evening, you used to fix everything. I can't fix what's already leaving, I told her. From that night on, she stayed. She read aloud when I couldn't speak, filled the rooms with sound so I wouldn't notice how empty they'd become. A few days before her mother passed, we sat by the window watching the sunset spill across the yard. She took my hand. Promise me, she whispered, don't let them turn this place into something it's not. I nodded. Just keep it home, she said. That was the last promise I ever made that still feels alive. Now, years later, that same table holds another envelope. Different paper, same danger. I looked at it and thought of that scarred line from long ago, the one that taught me how easy it is to give away more than you meant to. Emily came in quietly. You're still up. Just remembering, I said. Her eyes went to the envelope. You're not going to sign anything, right? I smiled faintly. Not tonight. She leaned in, kissed my cheek. Good. Then tomorrow we'll throw that thing away. When she left, I whispered to the house, "Not this time." After Mark left that night, the house stayed loud long after the door slammed. His anger echoed off the walls, and for a moment I thought I could still hear him arguing in the hallway just like when he was 16. My wife once told me, "You and Mark are too much alike. That's why you fight." I laughed at the time, but she was right. We both wanted control, both too proud to admit when we were wrong. I sat in his old room for a while, staring at the posters still on the wall. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paint. I remember whispering, "He'll come around," but he never did. That silence between us grew roots. By the time my wife got sick, it was already something living in the house, something we stopped trying to fix. Morning light crept through the curtains, thin and gray. The house still smelled of smoke from last night's grill and half-melted wax. I sat at the table where the cake had been, staring at crumbs and candle wax as if they could tell me what went wrong. Emily moved quietly around the kitchen, stacking plates into the sink. "You should rest, Dad," she said. "I slept enough," I told her, though my eyes burned. She poured coffee, then leaned on the counter. "You sure you're okay about last night, about what I asked? That phone call I overheard. Mr. Lewis?" I forced a smile. "Probably just business. People like Linda always have someone to call." Emily frowned. "Still, don't sign anything, okay? I won't." But even as I said it, I thought of the red envelope sitting in the drawer, the one I hadn't thrown away. Something in me wanted to look again, just to make sure I hadn't imagined that faint corporate logo in the corner. Around 10, the doorbell rang. Linda's perfume arrived before she did. "Morning, Frank," she said brightly, stepping inside as if she still owned the air around her. Mark followed, carrying a bakery box and 2 takeaway coffees. "Did we wake you?" Linda asked. "No, just cleaning up," I said. "Perfect," she said. "We came to help and to drop off what we forgot last night." She set a cream-colored envelope on the table, tied with a silver ribbon. "Your real birthday gift," she said. Emily appeared in the doorway, hair messy, eyes narrow. "Another one?" Linda laughed, ignoring her tone. "Don't worry, honey, this one's not edible." I forced a chuckle, untied the ribbon. Inside was a stack of papers. The first page had neat black print and bold letters across the top. "Transfer of title parcel. 48. My breath caught. "What is this?" Linda said, her voice sugary. "It's nothing serious, just something Mark and I put together. Estate planning, simplifying things." Mark stepped forward quickly. "It's just to help you, Dad. Taxes are insane. This makes everything easier later on." Emily crossed her arms. "Later on meaning after he's gone?" Linda's smile froze. "Don't be dramatic. It's called pre-approval. We sign now, it takes effect only if, well, someday." "Someday," I repeated. The word tasted wrong. Mark put a hand on my shoulder. "Dad, it's smart. The land value's gone up. This keeps it in the family name. You'll still live here. Nothing changes." I stared at the paper again. The first paragraph began, "This transfer hereby conveys all rights and ownership of said property to Mark Dalton and Linda Dalton upon execution of signature." My name waited at the bottom, an empty line. Emily's voice shook. "You tricked him. You were going to make him sign this at the party." Linda rolled her eyes. "We were going to explain, but the timing wasn't right. He was emotional. Everyone was around." "Right," Emily snapped. "Perfect time to steal his house." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's enough, Emily." "No," she said. "You can't talk your way out of this." I lifted the page, hands trembling slightly. "You printed this before last night." Linda's tone softened dangerously. "Frank, please. You're reading it out of context. It's only a draft with your signatures already on it." Silence spread through the kitchen like smoke. I looked at my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Is this what last night was?" I asked. "The party, the speeches, the toast." "Dad, come on," Mark said. "Don't make this bigger than it is. We're just planning ahead." "Planning ahead," I repeated. "For my house." He rubbed his face. "You always do this. You think everything's betrayal. It's paperwork." Emily stepped between us. "Then why hide it?" Linda exhaled loudly, grabbing the papers. "You two are impossible. I tried to do something responsible, and this is what I get." She stuffed the documents back into the envelope. "Fine, forget it. We'll have the lawyer shred it." Her voice trembled just slightly enough to tell me she was lying. When they left the room, felt heavier than before. Emily closed the door behind them and leaned against it, shaking. "Dad, they were really going to do it. I nodded slowly. I know. What now? Now we breathe, I said, and we wait. She frowned. For what? For the truth to show itself. It always does. I looked at the coffee Linda had brought. It sat untouched, cooling fast. The cream swirled into pale clouds, dissolving just like trust. That afternoon, Mark texted me. Sorry about earlier. Linda means well. Maybe we can talk later alone. I stared at the message for a long time, then turned off my phone. I'd spent years believing silence kept peace, but sometimes silence only teaches people how to take more. After they left the house, didn't feel like mine anymore. Every shadow looked like a secret. Every sound felt rehearsed. Emily made tea, but neither of us drank it. She sat across from me, elbows on the table, eyes red from holding back tears. Dad, she said quietly, I don't understand how they could do that. How can family look you in the face and still lie? I sighed. It's not that simple, sweetheart. People convince themselves that taking is helping. She shook her head. No. They convince themselves that you won't fight back. That one hit harder than I expected. I tried to smile. Maybe I should have yelled. Emily frowned. You shouldn't have to. It's your house. We sat in silence. Outside, wind brushed the windows, and somewhere down the hall, a loose door hinge groaned a sound I'd meant to fix for years. Emily finally spoke. You think they'll try again? They already did, I said. They just failed the first time. She looked up sharply. You're not seriously thinking of forgiving them, are you? I'm thinking, I said slowly, that people who lie that easily don't stop after one attempt. Her voice cracked. Then what do we do? We wait, I said, and we listen. Later that evening, I went to take the trash out. The sky had turned the color of old metal, heavy and still. As I passed the side gate, I heard voices near the fence, muffled, low, urgent. Linda's. He won't sign yet. He's suspicious. A pause, then a man's voice, then find another way. We can't delay this closing again. My chest went cold. Closing. That was no pre-approval. I stepped closer, but a board creaked under my foot. The voices stopped. Then Linda's heels clicked quickly toward the car. She didn't look back as she drove away. Back inside, Emily was in the living room sorting mail. She looked up. You okay? Fine, I said, forcing a steady tone. You seen my old paperwork drawer, the one in your office? Yeah. Could you bring it here? She nodded, then returned with the wooden box. I opened it. Dusty folders, receipts, an old photo of my wife smiling by the fence, and near the bottom, the original property deed. The edges were yellowed, but my wife's handwriting was still there, the note she'd scribbled on the corner. Don't let go of what we built, even when they say it's for your own good. Emily leaned over my shoulder. Mom wrote that? Yeah. Dad, she whispered, we can't let them touch this house. I nodded. We won't. She looked at the deed, then at me. So what's next? I closed the folder gently. Next, we stop pretending this is just about family. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floor felt like someone walking outside. I sat by the window with a cup of cold coffee and watched headlights move down the road. For the first time in years, I locked every door in the house. I don't know what scared me more, the idea of losing the home, or the thought that my own blood would be the one to take it. As the clock struck midnight, I whispered to the dark, I won't sign anything. Not again. Then I looked at the old deed one more time and realized the only way to protect what's mine is to find out just how far they've already gone. The next morning, the house was unnervingly calm. I made coffee just to hear a sound. Emily had left early for work, but she'd taped a note on the fridge. Don't meet them alone. I smiled faintly. She didn't have to write that. I already knew. Still around 9, Mark showed up again. No Linda this time. Just my son standing on the porch with that half-sorry, half-defensive expression I'd seen too many times before. Morning, Dad, he said. Morning, I answered. Coffee. He hesitated, then nodded. He looked around the kitchen. Linda told me you got upset yesterday. She didn't mean to. I cut him off. Don't start with that. He swallowed hard. I just want to clear things up. Then start by telling me the truth. He sat down, rubbing his temples. It wasn't what you think. The transfer papers. It's not a sale. It's just a precaution, a pre-approval form. The lawyer said it's smart to have one signed early in case. In case I die, I said. He winced. That's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. My voice was low, steady. You planned it. The phone calls, the papers, the speech, even the cake. Mark's shoulders slumped. Dad, please, you're blowing this up. Linda's just organized. Organized, I repeated. That's one word for it. He looked up at me frustrated. She's trying to protect what's ours. If something happens to you, the taxes, the paperwork. It's all chaos. This way it stays in the family. I stared at him for a long time. In the family, I said quietly. You mean yours? He didn't answer. When Emily came home later, she found me sitting at the kitchen table again, the same spot where everything seemed to fall apart. They're not stopping, are they? She asked. No, I said. Mark came alone today. Her eyes widened. What did he say? That it's just a pre-approval, she scoffed. He actually said that word for word. She shook her head. That's Linda talking, not him. Does it matter? I asked softly. He's still the one carrying the papers. Emily sat beside me. We can go to a lawyer, right? Check if anything's been filed. I nodded. We will, but even as I said it, something told me it was already too late. That night the phone rang. The old landline, the one that almost never rang anymore. I answered. Mr. Dalton? A man's voice said, polite but sharp. This is Robert Lewis. I just wanted to confirm our meeting tomorrow. I froze. Meeting? Yes. Your son mentioned we'd finalize the signature once the papers were ready. I see, I said slowly. Where's this meeting? Dalton residence, 11 a.m. He said you'd prefer it home. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Thank you, Mr. Lewis, I said, and hung up. Emily came out of her room, worried. Who is that Mr. Lewis? I said. Apparently I have a meeting tomorrow. Her eyes flashed. He called here. Looks that way. She folded her arms. They're planning to corner you again. Maybe, I said quietly, but this time I'll be ready. The next morning, the driveway filled with the sound of tires. Linda's white SUV stopped neatly by the fence. She stepped out first, heels clicking like small threats. Mark followed, carrying a slim folder. Morning, Frank, Linda said sweetly. Mr. Lewis will be here soon. We just need 5 minutes of your time. I'm sure you do, I replied. Emily came down the hall, phone in hand, eyes fierce. Funny, she said, because I already called the county clerk's office. There's no record of a pre-approval, only a pending title transfer filed under your name. Linda froze. That's not possible. Emily lifted her phone. You want to see the confirmation email? Mark's face turned pale. Linda, she glared at him, whispering, you said you'd handle it. The air in the kitchen turned electric. Linda straightened her jacket, trying to recover her composure. Okay, fine. Maybe there was a miscommunication. But you're overreacting. Emily slammed her phone down. No, you're lying. Enough, Mark shouted. You're tearing this family apart. I stood slowly, letting the chair scrape against the tile. Family doesn't need help tearing itself apart, I said. All it takes is one bad deal. They stared at me, startled by the calm in my voice. I gestured to the table. You want a signature? Here. I picked up a pen, pressed it against the paper, then stopped. The pen trembled slightly in my hand. I looked up. Before I sign anything, I want you both to tell me the truth. Linda's lips parted, but no words came. Mark whispered, Dad, please don't do this. Don't do what I asked. Don't read the fine print. Just then Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then froze. Her voice dropped. Dad, it's an email from Mr. Lewis. Linda lunged toward her. Give me that. Emily stepped back. It's addressed to you, Linda. Transfer confirmation, client signature pending. She turned the screen toward me. Below the message was a PDF attachment titled Final Title Transfer, daltonproperty.pf. I looked at Linda. So it wasn't about taxes or family. It was about money. She said nothing. Mark swallowed hard. Dad, please. She just wanted to make things easier, for who I asked, you or the buyer. No one spoke. The silence was sharp enough to cut through the air. When Mr. Lewis arrived, he found the door locked. Through the window, he could probably see me standing there holding the papers. I didn't open the door. Instead, I turned to Emily. Keep this email safe, I said. Print it. Back it up. She nodded, still shaking. Mark and Linda stood on the porch arguing in low voices. I could hear fragments, "You promised, not my fault, he'll ruin everything." I waited until their car disappeared down the road before I spoke again. Emily exhaled shakily. "What now?" I looked down at the papers still unsigned. "Now," I said, "we find out what else they've already done." I placed the envelope back into the drawer next to the old deed my wife and I once signed together. Same desk, same house, different war. As I closed the drawer, I whispered. This time I read every line. That night the rain came quietly. No thunder, no warning. Just a steady whisper against the windows like the house itself was trying to speak. I sat in the living room with every light off except one lamp. The same lamp my wife used to read by. Its light was small, barely enough to fill the space, but maybe that's what peace looks like when you've lived long enough, dim but honest. On the table lay two things: the old deed we'd signed together and the new transfer papers they'd tried to make me sign, both with space for my name. One built a life, the other almost erased it. Emily came down the stairs in her robe, hair messy, eyes soft. "You're still awake," she said. "Seems like that's all I do lately." She sat beside me, pulling her knees up like she used to when she was little. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. "Not tonight." "Tomorrow then?" I shrugged. People like that don't quit easily, but they always come back weaker. She smiled faintly, then went quiet. For a while we just listened to the rain. It tapped the roof in uneven rhythms like an old clock losing count. I keep thinking, she said softly, how Mom would have handled this. I smiled. She'd probably have thrown the papers in the fireplace. Emily laughed just once, then her voice cracked. "She always saw through them, didn't she?" "She did," I said. "She saw through everyone, even me." Her eyes turned toward me. "What do you mean?" I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "When Mark first asked for that loan, she warned me. Said I was teaching him to reach before he learned to build. I didn't listen. I thought helping him was love." Emily squeezed my hand. "It was. Maybe," I said. "But love without boundaries is just permission." The rain grew heavier, washing against the porch like a confession. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the yard looked ghostly in the dim light, wet grass, broken fence post, a tire swing still moving from the wind. When I was younger, I thought being a father meant fixing things, keeping everything from falling apart. But time has its own agenda. It teaches you that some things shouldn't be fixed. Some cracks are supposed to show you where the light gets in. Emily joined me by the window. "Do you hate him?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "No, I hate what he's become, but hating him won't change that." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't agree. "I don't get it," she said. "How can you still defend him after what he tried to do?" Because I said quietly, "He's still my son, and that's the cruelest part of it." I turned toward her. "You'll understand one day when someone you love hurts you so bad that walking away would be easy, but staying hurts even more." She wiped her eyes. "So what happens now? I'm not sure," I said. "But I know one thing: he's expecting me to yell, to curse, to make a scene. Then what will you do?" I smiled faintly. "Nothing louder than the truth." Emily frowned, puzzled. "That sounds like Mom again." "It does," I said. "Maybe that's a good sign." I sat back down, folded the deed carefully, and placed it in an envelope marked personal. Then I slid it into the drawer next to the unsent birthday cards my wife used to keep. "You're hiding it?" Emily asked. "Protecting it," I said. "Sometimes hiding is the same thing, just quieter." She studied me for a long moment. "You've changed. Maybe I finally caught up to my mistakes." The rain slowed. The quiet afterward was heavier than the storm. I poured us both some tea, cold by now. But it gave our hands something to hold. "You ever wonder," I said, "why people hurt the ones they love most?" Emily looked at me, unsure how to answer. "Because they expect forgiveness," I said. "They gamble that love will cover the damage." She whispered. "Will you forgive him?" "I already have," I said. "But that doesn't mean I trust him." I looked at the old family photos on the mantel, one of Mark as a boy, holding a model airplane. Another of my wife laughing so hard, her eyes disappeared. Somewhere between those moments, something had gone missing. Maybe not love. Maybe just the part of love that remembers how to listen. Emily rested her head on my shoulder. "You're a better man than he deserves." "No," I said softly. "I'm just old enough to know anger doesn't fix anything. It just makes the ruins louder." She smiled through her tears. You sound like her. I wish I was half as strong, I said. She'd have known what to do. She'd be proud, Emily whispered. Maybe I said. But I'm not sure she'd forgive me for letting it get this far. Outside, thunder murmured somewhere distant, low and tired. I turned off the lamp and watched the room fade into shadow. If you caught your child betraying you, I said quietly, would you forgive or just stop pretending? Emily didn't answer. Maybe she didn't have to. Because sometimes forgiveness isn't a choice. It's the only way to stay human. And tonight, that felt like enough. But the quiet didn't last long. Silence. I've learned isn't peace, it's memory stretching its legs. I found myself reaching for the photo album again. Inside, there was a picture of my wife standing on the porch the day we moved in, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. She'd written something on the back in her looping cursive, "This house will keep us honest." I traced the words with my thumb, smiling at the irony. Maybe she knew honesty was the first thing a family trades when money starts whispering. I remembered the last night she was here, how she took my hand and said, "Don't let this place forget what we built, Frank. Promise me." I did promise. I said yes because it was easier than saying, "I don't know if I can." And yet here I am keeping that promise with shaking hands and sleepless nights. Maybe that's what love becomes when you're old. It stops being about saying yes and starts being about refusing to give up. Would you still love someone who tried to take everything from you? I ask myself that every night. And somehow the answer keeps coming back as yes, because love doesn't always protect, it just remembers what it was supposed to protect. Morning sunlight spilled through the curtains like nothing had happened. But I knew better. The house doesn't forget. It just waits for you to remember. I shaved, put on a clean shirt, and sat at the same table where the papers had been. The red envelope was still there, sealed again, edges smoothed like it had never been opened. At 9 sharp, the phone rang. It was Mark. "Dad, we need to talk. Please don't hang up." "I'm listening," I said. He hesitated. "Linda's upset. She thinks you're angry." "I'm not angry," I said quietly. "I'm awake." There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Can we come over?" I looked out the window. The sun hit the old oak tree just right, casting long shadows across the porch. "Sure," I said. "Bring her." They arrived 30 minutes later. Linda's smile was thinner now, her eyes darting around the room as if the walls might testify against her. Mark looked tired, older than yesterday, like guilt had aged him overnight. "Coffee?" I asked. "No, thank you," Linda said, folding her arms. I nodded toward the table. "Sit. Let's finish what you started." Mark swallowed. "Dad, we just came to apologize." "Good," I said. "Then we'll both get what we want." I slid the red envelope across the table. "This yours?" Linda's fingers twitched. "It's just paperwork I finished for her. You've said that before." I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. "You wanted my signature. You almost had it. But here's the thing. Signatures mean nothing if the person holding the pen knows the truth." Mark lowered his head. "I didn't want it to go this far. Then why did you?" I asked. "You think betrayal starts big?" "It starts with a lie, small enough to sound like help." Linda's voice hardened. "You're overreacting, Frank. It was business." "No," I said. "It was home." I walked to the drawer, pulled out the old deed, the one with my wife's handwriting still on the corner. I set it beside the new papers. "2 signatures," I said. "Same name, same house, but they mean opposite things." I looked straight at my son. "You remember what your mother told you when we first moved here?" Mark frowned. She said this place was built on love." I nodded. "And love's the one thing you can't refinance." For the first time, he couldn't look at me. Linda crossed her arms. "You can't guilt us forever, Frank. You're not the only one who's worked for this family." "You're right," I said. "You worked for yourself and used my name to do it." Her mouth opened, but I kept going. "I talked to Mr. Lewis. Nice man. He's going to return every document with my signature request voided. He also mentioned something about a commission, $20,000 wired to your account last week." Mark's head snapped toward her. "You told me it was just a consultation." Linda's voice cracked. I was going to tell you." "No," I said quietly. "You were going to sell my house and make sure it looked like his idea." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Finally, Mark spoke. "Dad, I don't know what to say. Then don't I said, just listen. I took the old deed in my hands, tracing my wife's faded note one last time. She built this house on trust, and you almost turned it into profit. He blinked hard, tears barely held back. I just wanted to fix things. You and Mom never believed in me. I believed, I said, my voice breaking. But belief isn't a loan, Mark. You pay it back with honesty, not signatures. Linda reached for his arm, but he pulled away. Emily came in, then quiet but firm. She looked at them both, then at me. Dad. It's done, I said. They won't be back. She studied me for a long second, then nodded. Linda stood grabbing her purse. You'll regret this. Maybe I said, but at least it'll be my regret. She stormed out. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house. Mark lingered a moment longer. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence folded up like an old receipt. I'm sorry, Dad, he whispered. I know I said, but sorry's not the same as change. He nodded once, then left. When the house fell silent again, I sat down. The old floor creaked under me the way it used to when my wife walked through late at night. Emily placed a hand on my shoulder. You did the right thing. Maybe I said softly, but it still hurts like the wrong one. She sat beside me. What now? I smiled faintly. Now we start fixing again. Not the walls, just the people who still belong here. I folded the old deed carefully and slid it back into the drawer. Then I tore the new papers in half slowly, deliberately, like ending a prayer. The wind outside shifted, brushing the curtains. For the first time in weeks, the house exhaled. I closed my eyes and whispered to the empty room, promise kept. 3 days passed. The house felt lighter, almost shy about it, as if it didn't quite know how to breathe without tension. Emily and I spent the weekend cleaning. We moved the old boxes from the attic, polished the dining table, even replaced the porch light that had gone out months ago. Every small task felt like reclaiming something: the air, the silence, the right to feel safe again. At one point, Emily found a half-burned candle from my birthday. She smiled and held it up. We should keep it. I nodded. A reminder. She shook her head. Proof we made it past the party. I laughed softly. You're your mother's daughter. On Sunday evening, the house was finally quiet again. I sat by the window watching dusk slide over the yard. The fence was fixed. The swing moved gently in the wind. It felt almost like forgiveness. Emily joined me with 2 cups of tea. Strange, isn't it? She said. How peace feels heavier than anger. Maybe that's how you know it's real, I said. She leaned on my shoulder. Do you think Mark will ever call? I stared at the fading light. He already did. In his own way. What do you mean, silence? I said. It's the longest apology there is. Later that night, as I was locking up, the phone rang. That same old landline again. For a second, I almost didn't answer, but something told me to. Hello? There was a pause. Then a voice, quiet, cracked. Dad. It was Mark. He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded small. I'm sorry, he said. I messed everything up. Linda left. She said I was useless. Maybe she's right. I took a slow breath. No, son. She's just louder than your conscience. He didn't reply, just breathed like a child trying not to cry. Dad, he said finally, I don't know how to fix this. Neither do I said. But you start by not running from it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I already did, I said softly. That's the easy part. The hard part's living like you mean it. He exhaled shakily. Can I come by sometime? Maybe, I said, when you're ready to talk, not just to explain. Then the line went quiet, and before I could say anything else, he hung up. I stood there for a long while, listening to the dial tone hum through the receiver. It sounded like a heartbeat, maybe his, maybe mine, maybe the house's. I turned off the lamp and whispered, "Come home when you remember why it mattered." The next morning, I found something on the porch, an envelope. No name, just a folded piece of paper inside. It was the photo of our family, the one from my 50th birthday. Mark, Emily, my wife, and me. On the back, written in messy ink, "Not too late." I smiled, not sure if I was supposed to cry. The morning wind lifted the edges of the photo like it wanted to carry it back inside, so I let it. By noon, Emily came home from work. Dad? What's that? She asked. Old picture, I said, holding it up to the light. She smiled. You kept it. Some things, I said, don't belong in drawers. We sat together on the porch sipping tea while the world went quiet again. Forgiveness doesn't rebuild what's broken, it gives you permission to start sweeping the pieces. Maybe that's all any of us can do. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I whispered to the house one last time. You kept your promise. So will I. The wind moved through the curtains, soft as breath. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't sound like goodbye. If you were in my place, would you open the door again if forgiveness knocked? Would you let it in even after it stole from you once? Let me know what you'd do. Because maybe that's where our stories meet. If it spoke to you, please like, comment, and subscribe to Echoes of Betrayal. Tell me in the comments, have you ever forgiven someone who didn't deserve it? Your story might be the one that helps someone else forgive tonight. Until next time. This is Frank's voice fading out, but not gone. Because some echoes never really die. Thank you for watching.